A man who threw his daughter off one of Melbourne's busiest bridges has been found guilty of murder.
Australia has witnessed some of the darkest crimes imaginable, stories that defy belief, not because they happened in shadows, but because they began within the walls of family homes. Behind closed doors, men who were meant to nurture and protect instead carried out acts that left their own children, partners, and communities devastated. These are not the stories of strangers or faceless offenders. They are the chilling accounts of fathers who crossed a line no parent ever should, and whose actions left scars that still echo across the nation. In this documentary, we'll uncover the most shocking cases where fathers turned into perpetrators of unimaginable harm, leaving Australia haunted by questions of how and why. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where and what time you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime content just like this. Anthony Robert Harvey, Bedford, Western Australia, 2018. In September 2018, police entered a suburban home in Bedford, Perth. Inside, they found 5 bodies, a mother, her 3 young daughters, and their grandmother. The killer was the children's father, Anthony Robert Harvey, and his crimes would earn him the harshest sentence in Western Australian history. Harvey was 24 years old, working in landscaping and sharing a home with his partner Mara Harvey, their 3 daughters, Charlotte, aged 3, and 2-year-old twins Alice and Beatrix, and Mara's mother, Beverly Quinn, 73. To neighbours, they looked like any other young family. Mara worked in retail and was described as caring and diligent, while Harvey was quiet, spending time with video games when not at work. Outwardly, nothing suggested the violence to come. But privately, Harvey admitted he had been struggling with dark thoughts, convinced his family's future was bleak. On the night of 3rd September 2018, after Mara returned from work, Harvey attacked her in the kitchen with a knife and a blunt instrument. He covered her body with a blanket and left her where she fell. Later that night, he entered his daughter's bedrooms. In his confession, he said he killed Charlotte, Alice, and Beatrix while they slept, using the same weapons. He then carried out routine tasks the next day, buying cleaning supplies, ordering takeaway food, while the bodies remained in the house. For 4 days, Harvey stayed in the home, writing in a journal about what he had done, playing video games, and planning his next steps. On 7th of September, when Mara's mother Beverly arrived at the house, he killed her as well. By this point, Harvey claimed he intended to take his own life, but could not go through with it. Instead, he wrote a note apologizing to his family, describing his actions as part of a plan, and acknowledging the devastation he had caused. On the 9th of September, he drove more than 400 kilometers north to Pannawonica, a remote mining town where he had previously worked. There, he walked into the police station and calmly told officers he had killed his family. Police rushed to the Bedford home, where they confirmed his confession. Detectives later described the crime scene as one of the most confronting they had ever encountered. In June 2019, Harvey appeared in the Supreme Court of Western Australia and pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder. At sentencing in July 2019, Justice Stephen Hall said the crimes were so grave that they warrant the most severe penalty available. He described how Harvey had killed each victim methodically over several days, targeting people who were entirely defenseless and who should have been able to trust him most. Harvey was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. It was the first time this penalty had been imposed in Western Australia, marking his crimes as uniquely severe. The Bedford murders horrified the state and the country. The victims, 3 young children, their mother, and their grandmother, represented 3 generations of one family wiped out in less than a week. For Mara and Beverly's relatives, the pain was immeasurable. For the wider community, the killings raised difficult questions. How could such destructive thoughts spiral unnoticed? Could warning signs ever be detected early enough to prevent something like this? John Sharpe, Mornington, Victoria, 2004. In March 2004, suburban Melbourne was shaken by a crime that seemed unthinkable. A father killed his pregnant wife and toddler daughter with a spear gun, then appeared on national television to plead for their safe return. His name was John Miles Sharpe, remembered now as the Mornington Monster. Sharpe was 37, an accounts manager living in the seaside suburb of Mornington with his wife, Anna Kemp, a New Zealand-born lawyer. They had a 20-month-old daughter, Gracie, and Anna was 5 months pregnant with a boy they planned to name Francis. Outwardly, the family looked ordinary, but behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Sharpe resented Anna's stronger personality, worried about money, and did not want another child. Friends later recalled no obvious warning signs, but Sharpe himself admitted he felt trapped and resentful. On the night of 23 March 2004, Sharpe took a high-powered spear gun kept in the house and attacked Anna as she slept. He fired once, then reloaded and fired again. She died instantly, along with the unborn baby she was carrying. He hid her body in the garage, later burying it in a shallow grave in the backyard. 4 days later, on 27 March, Sharpe turned the spear gun on his daughter. Gracie was just shy of her 2nd birthday. He later told police he killed her because he believed she would be a burden if left without her mother. He placed her body in garbage bags and dumped it at the Mornington rubbish tip. Her remains were never recovered. Sharpe then constructed an elaborate lie. He told family and friends that Anna had left him and returned to New Zealand. To bolster the story, he sent fake text messages and emails from Anna's phone and computer, pretending she was alive and traveling. In April 2004, he even went on national television, giving an interview on Today Tonight, sitting in his living room. He appealed for Anna and Gracie to come home. The footage showed him calm and composed, a performance later replayed in court as an example of his deception. By mid-2004, the ruse was collapsing. New Zealand police could not find any record of Anna entering the country, and Australian detectives found inconsistencies in Sharpe's story. On the 20th of July 2004, after hours of questioning, Sharpe broke down and confessed to police. He admitted to killing Anna and Gracie with a spear gun and described how he disposed of their bodies. On the 28th July 2004, he was formally charged with their murders. Police later recovered Anna's remains from the backyard, but searches of the tip failed to locate Gracie. In August 2005, Sharpe faced the Supreme Court of Victoria. He pleaded guilty to both murders. The press branded him the Mornington Monster, a name that stuck. Justice Geoffrey Nettle sentenced him to 2 life sentences with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years. In his remarks, Justice Nettle said Sharpe had committed betrayals of the most fundamental human obligations and condemned both the planning and the lies that followed. The case horrified Australia not only for its brutality, but for its cold calculation. Sharpe killed his pregnant wife and toddler daughter, buried one, discarded the other, then staged a charade of concern for the cameras. It was family annihilation carried out not in a fit of rage, but through deliberate, chilling steps. For Anna's parents in New Zealand, the loss was compounded by the realization that the man they trusted had taken both their daughter and granddaughter. For the wider public, the case was a stark reminder that monstrous acts can hide behind suburban respectability. 2 decades later, the image of John Sharpe calmly speaking to television cameras, appealing for the return of the very family he had killed, remains one of the most haunting moments in Australian true crime history. Robert Farquharson, Winchelsea, Victoria, Father's Day, 2005. On Father's Day, 4th September 2005, the quiet town of Winchelsea, Victoria was shaken by a tragedy that would soon become one of Australia's most infamous family cases. A Holden Commodore, driven by Robert Farquharson, veered off the Prince's Highway and plunged into a roadside dam. Inside the car were his 3 young sons, Jai, aged 10, Tyler, aged 7, and Bailey, just 2 years old. Farquharson escaped from the sinking car, making it to the surface in the dam's edge. But his children did not. The initial shock was unbearable. A father alive on the bank, his boys gone beneath the dark water. At first, many assumed this was a catastrophic accident. Within hours, that assumption began to unravel. Speaking to police at the scene, Farquharson claimed he had suffered a sudden coughing fit that caused him to black out. a medical episode sometimes called cough syncope, where violent coughing can briefly cut blood flow to the brain. He insisted he awoke to find his car already submerged. Rescue teams pulled the Commodore from the dam and confirmed the deaths of the 3 boys. As the community grieved, investigators began to question whether this was really a freak medical event or something more deliberate. Over the following months, detectives pieced together a detailed reconstruction. Vehicle inspections showed no mechanical failure. Motorists who were on the highway that evening reported seeing the car deliberately cross lanes and head directly toward the dam, not drifting randomly as one might expect from a driver suddenly unconscious. The personal background also came into focus. Farquharson and his wife, Cindy Gambino, had recently separated. The boys were in his care for a Father's Day outing. Investigators heard from a former friend who testified that Farquharson had once spoken of paying back his ex-partners. 2 years later, in December 2009, the Court of Appeal overturned the convictions. Judges ruled that aspects of the trial, particularly the way expert medical evidence had been handled, were flawed enough to justify a retrial. For a moment, Farquharson's fate seemed uncertain. In 2010, the case returned to court under Justice Lex Lasry. Over nearly 10 weeks, jurors heard the evidence again. Witnesses described the Commodore's path. Engineers mapped the trajectory. Medical specialists debated whether cough syncope could cause such a direct plunge into a dam. The defense again insisted this was a tragic accident. But prosecutors presented a narrative of revenge, supported by testimony about Farquharson's resentment and threats. After days of deliberation, the jury once again found him guilty on all 3 charges. This time, Justice Lasry imposed life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years. He told the court the act was revenge against a former partner carried out in the most cruel way imaginable. Farquharson appealed again, but in 2012, the Court of Appeal dismissed his challenge, ruling the verdicts safe. A final attempt to reach the High Court also failed. By then, the case had become a permanent entry in Australian legal history. 2 separate juries, years apart, both rejecting the blackout defense and finding intent beyond reasonable doubt. For Cindy Gambino, the mother who lost all 3 of her children, the years after the trial were marked by unimaginable grief. In court, she described her sons as her life, her soul, her everything. She campaigned to ensure victims' families were treated with dignity, and her victim impact statements were widely quoted in sentencing remarks. Cindy herself passed away in 2022, a further blow for a family already scarred by tragedy. After her death, public debate reignited around how convicted killers can still hold certain legal rights over family memorials. In 2024, Victoria amended laws to prevent offenders from controlling decisions about the burial or commemoration of their victims. Authorities confirmed that Farquharson's name would be removed from the boy's headstone, a change many viewed as long overdue. Nearly 20 years later, the Farquharson case is still raised in legal and criminology circles. Supporters of his defense continue to argue rare medical conditions were not properly considered, but the courts have consistently upheld the jury findings. In 2024, news broke that Farquharson was preparing a new appeal under Victoria's second right of appeal laws, which allow cases to be reopened if fresh and compelling evidence emerges. For now, his convictions and 33-year minimum sentence stand firm, but the possibility of another legal chapter keeps the story alive. Arthur Freeman, Westgate Bridge, Melbourne, 2009. On the morning of 29th of January 2009, traffic across the Westgate Bridge was heavy with commuters heading into Melbourne. Among them was a Toyota Hilux driven by Arthur Philip Freeman, a 36-year-old father. In the back seat were his 3 children, Ben, 6, Darcy, 4, and Jack, 2. It was the first day back at school after the summer break. Within minutes, one of the most ordinary of routines, a school drop-off, would become one of Australia's most haunting tragedies. Freeman had separated from his wife, Peter Barnes, in 2008. They shared parenting arrangements, but the relationship was marked by bitterness and a custody dispute before the Family Court of Australia. Friends later said Freeman felt humiliated by the separation, convinced he was being edged out of his children's lives. Relatives noticed a change in him. He became quiet, withdrawn, and increasingly resentful. At times he vented that PETA had won and that he had lost everything. His sister testified later that in the weeks before the tragedy, he appeared consumed by anger and self-pity. These warning signs did not trigger any official intervention, but they painted a picture of a man struggling to cope with the collapse of his marriage. That morning, Freeman picked up his children from PETA's home in Hawthorne East. Darcy, excited for her first day back at school, spoke briefly to her mother on the phone before leaving. It would be the last time PETA heard her daughter's voice. As Freeman drove west toward the city, traffic slowed on the Westgate Bridge. At around 9 a.m., without warning, he pulled into the emergency lane. Witnesses later recalled him getting out calmly, opening the rear door, and lifting Darcy from her seat. In full view of stunned motorists, he carried her to the edge of the bridge. Then, in a single chilling act, he dropped her over the railing 58 meters into the Yarra River below. Dozens of drivers watched in disbelief. Some screamed, others jumped from their cars and ran toward Freeman. One motorist later described the sight of the little girl falling like a rag doll before vanishing into the water. Freeman returned to the driver's seat, his two sons still strapped in, and drove off. Police were alerted immediately, and a citywide search began. Meanwhile, water police and rescue crews launched into the river. Darcy was pulled from the water and rushed to the Royal Children's Hospital, but her injuries were fatal. Around 45 minutes later, police intercepted Freeman at Spotswood, only a few kilometers from the bridge. He was arrested without resistance. His sons, though unharmed physically, were distraught. News of the act spread rapidly. For Melbourne, it was almost incomprehensible. A child killed not in secret, but in the middle of the morning rush hour, before dozens of witnesses. Many commuters who saw the event required trauma counseling. For Darcy's mother, the loss was indescribable. She later told the court how only minutes earlier she had been wishing her daughter a happy school day. Now, she was forced to live with the knowledge that her little girl's final moments were played out before a city of strangers. In 2011, Freeman went on trial at the Supreme Court of Victoria before Justice Paul Coghlan. The central question was not what happened. Everyone agreed on that. But why? The defense argued that Freeman was in the grip of a severe depressive illness. Psychiatrists testified that he felt hopeless, humiliated by his separation, and terrified of losing his children. They suggested that in that moment on the bridge his thinking was distorted, and he was unable to control his actions. The prosecution insisted this was no loss of control, but a calculated act. They pointed to the way Freeman pulled over in traffic, walked around the car, and chose Darcy, the middle child. Witnesses described his movements as deliberate, not frenzied. The Crown argued he intended to punish his ex-wife in the most devastating way possible. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard expert opinions, witness accounts, and recordings of Freeman's conversations with family in the days prior. One relative recalled him saying PETA would suffer for what she had done. In April 2011, the jury found Freeman guilty of murder. Justice Coghlan sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 32 years. In sentencing, the judge told him, "You deliberately took the life of your daughter. It was a shocking betrayal of trust, an act intended to cause the greatest possible pain to your former wife." Freeman showed little visible reaction as the words were read. He was taken to prison, where he remains to this day. The Freeman case prompted national discussion about family law disputes and child safety. Experts stressed that warning signs had been present, a father spiraling into bitterness, making comments about revenge, and showing clear signs of emotional decline. Yet no mechanisms were in place to intervene before the tragedy. Darcy Freeman's life was only beginning, described by a family as happy, loving, and curious about the world. That future was taken in an instant, and the public's horror has never fully faded. John Edwards, West Pennant Hills, New South Wales, 2018. On the evening of 5 July 2018, the quiet Sydney suburb of West Pennant Hills was shattered by gunfire. Inside a family home, two teenagers, Jack, 15, and Jennifer, 13, were killed by their father, John Edwards. Their deaths exposed not only a personal tragedy, but also the failures of a system that had been warned about the danger for years. Edwards was a 67-year-old retired financial planner. To some, he seemed respectable, neatly dressed, articulate, and successful in his career. But beneath the surface was a long and well-documented history of violence. Over decades, several of his former partners had reported him for abuse. Police records described intimidation, harassment, and physical assaults. Multiple women secured apprehended violence orders, AVOs, to keep him away. Yet these incidents were treated as separate cases, never pieced together to form a complete picture of how dangerous he was. His final relationship was with Olga Edwards, a lawyer originally from Russia. Together they had two children, Jack and Jennifer. By 2016, the marriage had collapsed. Olga described Edwards as manipulative and threatening. She repeatedly told friends and professionals that she feared for her safety and for the children's. By 2017, the teenagers themselves wanted little to do with their father. Jack and Jennifer confided in teachers and counselors about their distress. Olga was pushing through the family court to limit Edwards' access. But the legal process was slow and fractured, and he continued to have contact rights despite her warnings. In 2017, Edwards applied for a firearms license. Despite his history of abuse, the application was approved. Critical information held by police and courts was not fully shared with the New South Wales Firearms Registry, which assessed him as low risk. In early 2018, Edwards purchased two pistols from the St. Mary's Indoor Shooting Centre, where he had recently become a member. The fact that a man with such a record could arm himself legally would later stand at the center of the coronial inquest. On the 5 July 2018, Edwards set out to attack his children. He had been monitoring their routines and knew where they would be that evening. At the West Pennant Hills home, where Jack and Jennifer were staying, Edwards forced his way inside. Carrying one of the legally purchased pistols, he shot both teenagers at close range. They died instantly. He left almost immediately, driving back to his own house in Normanhurst. Later that night, he took his own life. Neighbors who heard the shots raised the alarm. When police entered the house, they found Jack and Jennifer's bodies. Officers later said the scene was one of the most confronting of their careers. For Olga, the devastation was beyond words. She had warned the courts and the police. She had told them Edwards was dangerous. She had begged for protection for her children. None of it was enough. In the months after the murders, Olga struggled with unbearable grief. She could not return to the family home. Friends described her as broken, carrying a pain she could not escape. On 6th of December 2018, just 5 months after losing her children, Olga also died by suicide. Her death magnified the outrage. The system had not only failed Jack and Jennifer, it had failed their mother as well. A coronial inquest began in 2020, led by Deputy State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan. Its task was to uncover how Edwards had been able to carry out the killings when so many red flags had been raised. The findings, delivered in 2021, were damning. The inquest heard that Edwards' long record of abusive behavior was known to police but not shared with the firearms registry. That gap allowed him to obtain his weapons legally. The family court process also came under scrutiny. Olga's lawyers had repeatedly highlighted Edwards' controlling behavior, but judges did not have access to his complete history. The coroner concluded that Jack and Jennifer's deaths were preventable. She stressed that if the systems had been better connected, Edwards would not have had guns, and the family court might have acted to restrict his access. Among her recommendations were stronger background checks for firearms licenses, improved interagency data sharing, and greater weight given to the voices of victims and children in custody disputes. In the years after the inquest, reforms were introduced in New South Wales. Firearm vetting processes were tightened, and agencies were directed to share information more effectively. Advocates welcomed the changes, but noted that they came only after the deaths of 2 children who should have been protected. Damien Little, Port Lincoln, South Australia, 2016. On the morning of 4th of January 2016, the South Australian town of Port Lincoln woke to tragedy. A white station wagon had plunged off the local wharf into the sea. At first, it looked like a tragic road accident, but when divers recovered the vehicle, they found 3 bodies inside: Damien Little, age 34, and his 2 young sons, Hunter, 4, and Coda, just 10 months old. What seemed accidental was soon revealed as a deliberate act of murder-suicide. To those around him, Damien Little appeared to be a devoted father. He worked as a mortgage broker, had been a talented local footballer, and was often seen doting on his sons. Photos showed him smiling with his wife Melissa and their children, painting the image of a normal, happy family. But that picture hid another reality. Behind the scenes, Damien was struggling. The 2019 coronial inquest found no evidence of diagnosed mental illness and no history of treatment, but suggested he may have been experiencing significant psychological distress. Friends and family did not see obvious warning signs. In public, he seemed calm, but in private, he was planning an act that no one imagined he was capable of. Just after sunrise on 4th of January 2016, Damien placed Hunter and baby Coda into the back of his car. Forensic evidence later revealed that, before leaving home, he shot both boys with a rifle that he legally owned. Their lives ended before the drive to the wharf. With their bodies strapped into the car, Damien drove to the waterfront. Without slowing, he accelerated down the ramp and launched the vehicle into the water. It sank quickly. Witnesses initially believed the driver had lost control, but when police divers reached the submerged car, they found the rifle inside and confirmed that the children had been shot before the plunge. The discovery turned a supposed accident into a devastating crime. News of the death spread rapidly across South Australia. For Melissa, the reality was incomprehensible. She had gone to bed the night before unaware that her husband intended to end not only his own life, but also those of their sons. In a statement days later, she described her grief as indescribable, saying her entire world had been taken from her in a single morning. The coronial inquest confirmed police findings. Damien's actions were premeditated. He had chosen the time and place, used his licensed firearm to kill his sons, and then driven into the sea. The coroner found no evidence of intoxication or a sudden loss of control. Instead, the killings were planned and deliberate. Port Lincoln is a close-knit coastal town, and the tragedy left deep scars. Sporting clubs where Damien had once played football held memorials for Hunter and Coda. Friends, neighbors, and strangers gathered at vigils, leaving flowers, toys, and handwritten notes along the wharf. For many, the case was especially hard to reconcile because Damien had seemed so outwardly devoted to his boys. Parents in the town reflected on how appearances can mask hidden turmoil and how easily devastating actions can unfold without visible warning. The Port Lincoln tragedy highlighted the difficulty of detecting silent breakdowns. Damien gave little outward indication of his intent, yet he methodically planned the deaths of his sons and himself. For authorities and communities, it underscored the limits of relying solely on visible warning signs. The case also sparked discussion about firearm access. The rifle used was legally owned. The coroner noted that while Damien was not flagged as high risk under existing systems, his actions showed how hidden struggles can still lead to catastrophic outcomes. Geoff Hunt, Lockhart, New South Wales, 2014. In September 2014, the quiet farming community of Lockhart in southern New South Wales was shaken by a tragedy that seemed impossible to comprehend. A respected local farmer, Geoff Hunt, killed his wife and 3 young children before taking his own life. For a town that had seen him as steady and dependable, the revelation was devastating, and the case became one of the darkest examples of family annihilation in Australia's history. Geoff Hunt was 44, known for his work ethic and calm demeanour. He lived on the outskirts of Lockhart with his wife Kim, 41, and their children, Fletcher, 10, Mia, 8, and Phoebe, 6. Kim was admired for her warmth and dedication to her children. Years earlier, she had suffered a serious brain injury in a car accident. Though she recovered enough to resume family life, she lived with ongoing fatigue and challenges in day-to-day functioning. Geoff stepped in as her primary carer while continuing to manage the family farm and raise 3 school-aged children. Friends and neighbours saw a resilient family, but Geoff carried heavy, unspoken pressures. Farming brought financial uncertainty, caregiving responsibilities were constant, and the demands of parenting weighed on him. Outwardly, he rarely complained. Privately, he was overwhelmed. On the night of 8th of September 2014, Geoff acted on a plan that would destroy his family. Using a legally owned firearm, he shot Kim inside their farmhouse. He then turned the weapon on each of his 3 children. Fletcher, bright and energetic. Mia, creative and thoughtful. And Phoebe, the youngest, just beginning her school years. After killing his family, Geoff left the house and drove to a dam on their property. There, he used the same firearm to take his own life. His body was later discovered inside his car. When relatives were unable to reach the family, they contacted police. Officers who entered the farmhouse found Kim and the children and later recovered Geoff at the dam. Detectives described the discovery as one of the most confronting scenes they had encountered, a family wiped out in their own home. The investigation quickly confirmed that Geoff Hunt alone was responsible. Police recovered a short suicide note inside his vehicle. It gave no detailed motive, but confirmed that the act was premeditated. Forensic evidence and witness statements helped reconstruct the sequence. Kim was shot first, followed by the children, before Geoff drove away to end his own life. Investigators ruled out sudden rage or an argument. The evidence pointed to a calculated act carried out in silence. A coronial inquest in 2015 examined the case in detail. The coroner concluded that Geoff Hunt's actions were deliberate and methodical, not the product of a sudden snap. His suicide note and preparations left no doubt of premeditation. The inquest acknowledged the real pressures Geoff had faced: the burden of caregiving, financial strain, and the challenges of parenting. But it was explicit that these circumstances could not explain or excuse his actions. The responsibility lay with him alone. The coroner categorized the case as a murder-suicide and stressed that even in the face of hardship, Geoff had choices, and the path he took ended in the deaths of 4 innocent lives. The Lockhart community was left stunned. The Hunts were well known, and the sudden loss of 5 family members left the town in deep grief. At Lockhart Central School, classmates placed flowers and children's drawings at the gates for Fletcher, Mia, and Phoebe. In another tribute, 5 white crosses were erected at the local showground, one for each member of the family. Neighbors and friends described disbelief. How could a man seen as devoted to his family commit such an act? The tragedy shook the foundations of a town built on close ties and mutual support. The Lockhart murders sparked national conversations. They highlighted the immense pressures faced in rural communities, where financial stress, isolation, and caregiving responsibilities can quietly build. They also underscored the reality of hidden domestic violence, that behind outward stability, some families face risks that are neither visible nor reported. Rowan Baxter, Camp Hill, Queensland, 2020. On the morning of 19th of February 2020, what began as a normal school run in suburban Brisbane turned into one of Australia's most harrowing tragedies. Hannah Clark, 31, was taking her 3 children to school when her estranged husband, Rowan Baxter, ambushed her outside her parents' home in Camp Hill. Minutes later, the car was engulfed in flames. Hannah and the children would not survive, and Baxter was also found dead. The attack shocked the nation and ignited a fierce debate about how Australia understands and responds to coercive control. To friends and neighbours, Hannah Clark appeared to live a typical suburban life. She was a devoted mother to her children, Aaliyah, 6, Lyanna, 4, and Trey, 3, and remained close to her parents, Sue and Lloyd Clark, who lived nearby. But behind the surface, her marriage to Rowan Baxter had long been marked by control and intimidation. Baxter, a former fitness trainer and one-time NRL player, exercised a form of abuse now widely recognized as coercive control. He dictated what Hannah wore, monitored her social interactions, and restricted her independence. Friends later recalled how Hannah felt trapped, with even small decisions scrutinized. By late 2019, Hannah had decided to leave. She and the children moved into her parents' home for safety. Baxter's behavior escalated. He stalked her, sent threats, and attempted to use the family courts to maintain contact. Hannah obtained a domestic violence order, but enforcement gaps and fragmented services meant the risk he posed was underestimated. On that February morning, Hannah buckled her children into the car for the short drive to school. As she left her parents' driveway, Baxter ambushed her, carrying a knife and a can of petrol. He climbed into the vehicle, overpowered Hannah, and doused the interior with fuel. In an instant, the car was set alight. Flames engulfed the vehicle, trapping the children inside. Neighbors who rushed to help pulled Hannah from the driver's seat. Badly injured, she cried out to bystanders and later to paramedics. "He's poured petrol on me." The children, Aaliyah, Liana, and Trey, could not be saved. Baxter died nearby from self-inflicted stab wounds. Hannah, with burns covering most of her body, was rushed to hospital. Despite her determination to tell police what had happened, she died later that day. The attack stunned Australia. Vigils were held across Brisbane, with thousands lighting candles in memory of Hannah and her children. The image of 4 lives lost so violently in a suburban street forced a reckoning with how domestic violence is understood. Hannah's parents, Sue and Lloyd Clark, turned their grief into action. They spoke publicly about the abuse Hannah had endured long before the attack, not just physical threats, but daily coercion that eroded her freedom. They described their daughter as someone who lived walking on eggshells in her own home. Their advocacy brought the term coercive control into mainstream conversation. In March 2022, a coronial inquest examined the murders. Coroner Jane Bentley concluded that Hannah's death and the deaths of her children were foreseeable given the pattern of Baxter's behavior. The inquest found that agencies had missed multiple opportunities to intervene. The report highlighted systemic failures, poor information sharing between services, lack of urgency in enforcing protection orders, and insufficient recognition of coercive control as a red flag risk factor. One of its central recommendations was that police and frontline workers receive mandatory training to identify coercive control early before it escalates to lethal violence. The Camp Hill murders became a turning point in Australia's national conversation on family violence. In Queensland, the tragedy directly influenced the government's decision to introduce laws criminalising coercive control, with legislation passed in 2023. Other states began reviewing their frameworks, spurred by the widespread recognition that coercive control can be as dangerous as physical abuse. Hannah's parents established the Small Steps for Hannah Foundation, dedicated to education, prevention, and advocacy. Their work ensures that the names of Hannah, Aaliyah, Liana, and Trey remain central in the push for change. This case is remembered not only for its cruelty, but for the lessons it left behind. That coercive control is a form of violence, that warning signs cannot be ignored, and that systemic change is necessary to prevent families from enduring the same fate. Luke Batty, Tayab, Victoria, 2014. On the evening of 12 February 2014, the town of Tayab in Victoria gathered at the local oval for junior cricket practice. Among the players was Luke Batty, an energetic and cheerful 11-year-old who loved the game. Parents watched from the sidelines, children ran across the grass, and it was meant to be an ordinary weekday practice. But within minutes, the community witnessed an act of violence that would shock the nation. Luke was attacked by his father, Greg Anderson, in front of teammates and parents. His death became one of Australia's most heartbreaking tragedies, and it set in motion a movement that transformed the national conversation about family violence. Luke Batty lived primarily with his mother, Rosie Batty. Rosie had separated from Greg Anderson years earlier, but she believed that Luke deserved to have some relationship with his father, even though Anderson's behavior had long raised concerns. Greg Anderson's history included volatile behavior, breaches of intervention orders, and erratic incidents known to police. He struggled with mental health issues and displayed controlling tendencies. Rosie tried to manage the delicate balance between protecting Luke and allowing contact, hoping supervised visits and public settings would keep her son safe. She later described the constant anxiety of living with that decision. She never fully trusted Anderson, but felt torn, knowing Luke still wanted his father in his life. This tension, between safety and a child's wish to know their parent, shaped the years leading up to that tragic night in Tiab. At cricket practice that evening, Greg Anderson appeared on the sidelines. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Luke was chatting with friends when Anderson suddenly approached him. Without warning, Anderson launched a violent attack, using items at hand to fatally injure his son. The assault unfolded in front of stunned teammates, parents, and coaches. Witnesses rushed to help, but the injuries were catastrophic. Emergency services were called, and paramedics fought to save Luke's life, but he died that evening. Police arrived quickly and confronted Anderson nearby. He resisted arrest, and officers used non-lethal rounds and a taser to subdue him. Despite their intervention, Anderson inflicted fatal stab wounds on himself. He was taken into custody but died later from those injuries. Within hours, both Luke and his father were gone. The Tiab community was devastated. Parents struggled to comfort their children, many of whom had witnessed the attack. Schools and local organizations provided counseling, but the sense of shock lingered for months. For Rosie Batty, the grief was unimaginable. Yet just one day after losing her son, she stood before cameras and delivered a statement that moved the entire country. With extraordinary composure, she refused to let hatred dominate her message. She acknowledged Greg Anderson's struggles, saying, "No one loved Luke more than his father, but Greg's actions were driven by his own demons." Rosie shifted the focus to the broader issue, family violence. She made it clear that Luke's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a national crisis, claiming one woman or child every week. Her words, spoken in the rawest hours of grief, gave a human face to statistics that too often went ignored. Rosie Batty's courage resonated across Australia. Her advocacy brought unprecedented attention to domestic violence. She spoke openly about coercion, intimidation, and the systemic failures that left families unprotected. Her determination gave other survivors and families permission to speak out. In 2015, Rosie was named Australian of the Year, recognized for turning her personal tragedy into a national movement. She founded the Luke Batty Foundation, dedicated to raising awareness, improving support services, and preventing violence. Through media appearances, public talks, and political advocacy, she became the country's most prominent voice for Chan. Paul Rogers, Gold Coast, Robina, Queensland, and Peora, New South Wales, 2011. In May 2011, a chain of violent events unfolded across 2 states that would leave 4 people dead and expose deep cracks in Australia's response to domestic violence. Paul Rogers, a man with a long history of controlling and abusive behavior, killed his former partner, Tanya Simpson, and her friend Anthony Way on the Gold Coast. He then abducted his 5-year-old daughter, Kyla, drove across the border into northern New South Wales, and within hours both she and Rogers were found dead. The tragedy, later dissected in coronial inquests, revealed how years of warnings had gone unheeded and how systemic failures compounded the devastation. Paul Rogers' reputation was well known to police and the courts. For years he had been reported for assaults, intimidation, and breaches of protection orders. Women in his life, particularly his former partner Tanya Simpson, had endured cycles of violence and fear. Court records documented repeated intervention orders, but enforcement was inconsistent, and his escalating behavior continued largely unchecked. By 2011, Tanya had separated from Rogers and was trying to rebuild her life on the Gold Coast with her daughter Kyla. Friends described Tanya as caring and determined, focused on creating stability for her child despite the ongoing shadow of Rogers. But separation only intensified his attempts at control. He stalked her, issued threats, and refused to let go of the relationship. Authorities were aware of his record, yet he remained free to act. On the night of 15 May 2011, Rogers went to Tanya's townhouse in Robina. Inside were Tanya and her friend Anthony Way, who had been offering her support during the separation. Rogers entered the property and fatally attacked them both. The details were later set out in Queensland's coronial findings. The attack was deliberate, swift, and left no chance for escape. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, but were unable to intervene in time. By the time police arrived, Rogers had fled, taking Kyla with him. With Kyla in his car, Rogers drove south, crossing the border into New South Wales. Police in both states launched a massive manhunt, fearing for Kyla's life. Alerts were issued, roadblocks considered, and officers scrambled to track Rogers' movements. Despite these efforts, he managed to evade detection. Investigators would later piece together his route using phone records and sightings. He headed toward the Northern Rivers region, an area familiar to him, with a plan that would soon reach its grim conclusion. On the 16th May 2011, Rogers stopped near the small community of Peora, outside Casino. There, he ended his daughter's life before taking his own. When police located the vehicle, both were dead inside. For officers and family members, the discovery confirmed their worst fears. What had begun as a violent confrontation in Queensland had crossed jurisdictions and concluded as a murder-suicide. In less than 24 hours, 4 lives had been taken: Tanya, Anthony, young Kyla, and Rogers himself. The case prompted coronial inquests in both Queensland and New South Wales. Together, they revealed a pattern of failure. The Queensland inquest highlighted Rogers' long record of domestic violence and the repeated breaches of intervention orders that had not been properly enforced. It noted that his escalating conduct should have placed him on the highest risk category, requiring stronger monitoring and proactive management. The coroner stressed that systems designed to protect victims had been inadequate, and that his history was well known, yet insufficiently acted upon. The New South Wales findings examined the deaths of Kyla and Rogers. The coroner emphasized the difficulties police faced once Rogers crossed the border. Communication between states was limited, and there was no real-time mechanism to track such offenders. While officers responded quickly once the abduction was reported, the systems in place were simply not equipped to prevent the final outcome. Both inquests were united in their conclusion. This was not a sudden snap of violence. It was the predictable result of a long and visible pattern of abuse, coercion, and threats that had escalated without adequate intervention. Communities in both Robina and Casino were devastated. Vigils were held to honor Tanya, Anthony, and Kyla. Outside Tanya's townhouse, neighbors placed candles, flowers, and children's toys in her memory. For many, the grief was accompanied by disbelief that such a tragedy had been allowed to happen despite years of documented warnings. The Paul Rogers case remains one of the starkest examples of family violence escalating to catastrophic levels. It showed how a determined offender with a long record of abuse could slip through gaps in the system, leaving families unprotected even when the risks were visible. In the years since, Queensland and New South Wales have invested in CE-Ross border cooperation, improved risk assessment frameworks, and greater recognition of coercive control as a precursor to lethal violence. Yet for the families of Tanya, Anthony, and Kyla, those reforms came far too late. These cases show us a side of family life that is almost too painful to confront: fathers who chose control, anger, or despair over love and protection. Each story left families shattered, communities grieving, and an entire country asking how such tragedies could unfold undetected. But remembering these lives is not about glorifying the perpetrators. It's about honoring the victims, learning from the failures, and understanding the warning signs so that no family has to suffer the same fate again. Which of these cases struck you the hardest, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime content as we continue to explore the stories that haunt Australia.